Well, this week we've started talking about the relationships between parents and their children, moms and dads and their kids, if you will. And as I tried to explain last time, is that this is not a simple conversation, and in a way that Paul's directives here inadvertently really understate the complexity that parents are facing, especially in the dynamics that we're facing today. So the idea, he says, where honor your father and your mother, I know that immediately there's some people who are saying, but you don't understand what my parents were like. And I may know in theory, but I would agree with you. I don't really know. I'm not pretending like it's easy or simple or you had an easy go of it. And you may have as much to unlearn from dysfunctional family dynamics than you have to learn. There'll be more that you have to get rid of that enable, and that really happens by really not becoming parentless, but becoming reparented. And that's where I find that most of us, when we come to Christ, have to go through kind of a reparenting process. But part of that reparenting process has to begin with something that may be very hard for you, and that's the idea of honoring your father and your mother. And what I mean by honoring, I think what the scriptures mean by honoring is recognizing that you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. And the fact that you're with us today may be in large part because they did some good things right. Now, my parents, I'll be quite honest, were extremely dysfunctional people. I mean, they really had a terrible marriage. They didn't get along. They ended up living mostly separate lives, separate careers, they even slept in separate bedrooms. I mean, it was a dysfunctional dynamic, to say the very least. And it was so bad and so stressed that, I decided when I became a Christian, or before I became a Christian, that I would never get married. And I think the reason I got married was simple. I knew that I could never have an intimate relationship with anybody if I wasn't married. And so that became the first thing I realized, that if I want to avoid fornication or anything like that, it's going to require me to either take a vow of celibacy or to get married, because there's no middle ground there available. And some people think, well, that's so strict and that's so, well, actually doing right things always is a challenge, but I'm thankful that I did. Because my wife and I now have been married for 52 and a half years, and it's a consequence of that initial commitment that we made to one another. And I think in saying that, and I'm going to little get off topic here, but I think it's important for husbands and wives to remember is that divorce is the worst kind of parental betrayal that a husband and wife can do to their children. And it's really the first step in the collapse of a society. But, when parents get a divorce, when husband and wife separate like that, there's nothing normal ever again. There's nothing safe. And there's all sorts of multiple emotional dynamics that go into that young children feel out of control, and they respond differently. Some kids will just basically say, I have no control, so I'll do whatever I want. My parents didn't believe what they told me, so I don't believe anything they said, and I'm just going to live my life the way I want. And they kind of go off the deep end. And then you have other kids who say, I'm not safe here, so I'm going to start controlling everyone and everything in my life. I mean, these are just basically survival techniques that people develop. And the only way to break free from these kind of obsessive behaviors, and that's what they are, it's behaviors where you really kind of run to the extremes of life from absolute abandonment of control to the idea that you have to be in total control. And so as a consequence, you're a hard person to live with and to be around. And so how do we break those things? How do we begin to build those bridges back together? And the answer is you commit yourself to a truth that may not feel comfortable, that you may not be completely able to get your mind around, but you honor your father and your mother. That's where it begins. You begin to find things to honor them. And, it's kind of like the old practice of learning how to be thankful. Start thinking of things that you can be thankful for. Start thinking about things that you can honor your parents for. And it's interesting because, as I said, my parents had a tough relationship, and yet I inherited things from each of them. Now, I learned some bad habits that probably still nag me to one degree or another, but the simple fact is that my parents, just because of who they were and what they passed on to me genetically, enabled me to become who I was. And even though my father wasn't a deeply involved parent, he was at the same time the one who really promoted the idea of me reading. I mean, I was a little kid when my dad signed me up for a book club, and I got a book every week, and I started reading all the time instead of sitting in front of the television set. And that whole dynamic, I think I look back and say that discipline in my life wouldn't be here if my dad hadn't taken that initiative. My mother was an incredible hard worker, and so was my dad. And I think I learned a tremendous work ethic, and I learned the value of money and all sorts of things. I learned a few things about how to handle money and business acumen. There's things you just kind of picked up by being around people who are doing these things. And so, I'm thankful for that. Even my capacity to have certain verbal skills, or in many ways kind of being a wordsmith sometimes. Those are things that I picked up from being around my parents. And so I'm thankful for that. So when you start to say, what can I thank my parents for? I thank God that my parents loved me. It was imperfect, but they loved me. I'm thankful that they would make just about any sacrifice for me, and they really wanted me to do well, even though their definition of doing well was very different from my own. So when you realize that there are so many things to say thank you to for your parents, and just the fact that maybe they were terrible parents, but you inherited their intellectual capacity. You got their brain DNA. Praise God for that. You kind of got the brain DNA of somebody who's cognitively disabled, and you could be struggling along, just trying to make function in life. These distinctions are important, I think, in recognizing, what did I get? What did I receive? You may have had parents who weren't brilliant, but they loved you. They loved you with all their heart. And so, my wife still talks about when she was a little girl and talking about her dad untangling the rubber bands that her pigtails were in, and how gentle and patient and slow, and how he did everything he could just not to cause her any pain or discomfort. I mean, what did that say to her, even though he said nothing particular? The way he treated her, his physical contact with her, communicated, you're precious, you're beautiful, you're valuable, you're important, and I never want to cause you any pain. And those kind of things create huge, huge bonds. Now, you can look at other things and saying, well, he could have done this better, he could have done that. Yeah, that's true. But, I think, even when I think about her mom, who, bless her heart, despite some obvious personality deficiencies, and she had a rough life. I mean, she came by a lot of her problems honestly, came out of a pretty abusive home life. But you know what? She was one of the smartest women I ever, just native intelligent, and she passed that on to my wife. And there's things to be thankful for. That's all I'm saying. Just giving you examples from our life. There's always things that you can point to and saying, I'm thankful for this. Because most of us spend our time making a list of all the things we wish were different. It reminds me of a church one time that was looking for a new pastor, and they sent me a list of what they were looking for in a pastor. And I wrote them back and I said, I'm afraid Jesus is not available. I told them, I don't know anybody who's going to meet this standard. It was like, certainly none of them could have. And that's the problem. When we realize that our parents are people and they're flawed, and basically their responsibility has a time limit to it. The rabbis used to say that you can blame your parents for the first 40 years, but the next 40 years are your fault. I think we live in this age where I've seen people in their 50s and 60s who are stuck in some emotional, even mental or physical or economic way. They're stuck in place. They can't move forward with their life because they're still complaining about their parents. And here's the point. As soon as I realized that there were things that my parents did that I didn't want to emulate, the responsibility shifted from them to me. At that moment, it's my responsibility to say, how can I change that pattern in my life? My father had an explosive temper, and he came by it honestly. I mean, he had PTSD. I mean, he'd been through so many violent things in his life. In the military, I don't know how you avoid being like that. But boy, he couldn't take pressure, and he would just explode. And I realized I had become just like him. And I think the thing that when you realize that's not acceptable behavior, then you have to begin to go into your prayer closet and say, okay, God, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to react like that. And that's something that, has been a challenge for me my whole life, not overreacting. And that's the whole thing, not overreacting, because that was what I grew up with. But I had to admit, no, when I was first a young teenager, I felt justified by doing it. It was habitual, it was easy, and I felt right. It wasn't until I became a Christian I began to look at the scriptures, and Paul said to the Ephesians, be angry and don't sin. Suddenly I realized, okay, just getting angry is not okay. Overreacting is not okay. And you have to begin to ask God to tame that beast inside of you. I don't know what your besetting sin is. We all have them, scriptures tell us. But it's important to understand that the way we begin to break free from it is first honoring our parents, and then really recognizing those things that you don't like about them, that you didn't like in them, are the things that you need to work on in changing about yourself. Well, we'll continue on because this is such a huge topic. I get it. And I'll try to do it justice as we continue our conversation. Look forward to being with you tomorrow. Many blessings.